Welcome to our introductory course on Eternalism, the divine philosophy of the eternal worlds. Unit 31, Emergency Podcast for Parents of Latter-day Saint Youth, Part 6. In Unit 31, we continue this emergency podcast series for parents of Latter-day Saint Youth, diving deeper into the rising storm of artificial superintelligence, social media influencers, and unvetted spiritual impressions, forces capable of overwhelming today's youth. This rising storm underscores President Russell M. Nelson's warning that we will not survive spiritually in the coming days without the constant influence of the Holy Ghost. We began this emergency podcast series by addressing the rising threat of artificial superintelligence, ASI, a soulless digital intelligence rooted in computer code and now advancing with quantum capabilities. While it promises liberation from the burdens of reality, it ultimately pulls humanity away from thinking, choosing, and striving toward a transhuman and post-human future. We then explored how social media influencers and their godless algorithms replace truth with validation, offering meaning and worth through likes, shares, and follows, paving the way for digital super-influencers with godlike personas and intelligence. From there, we turn to religion itself. Despite its scandals and flaws, it continues to wield cultural influence because of its supernatural claims. We noted a trend among Gen Z toward religion, especially Catholicism, not necessarily in pursuit of truth, but in search of structure and emotionally compelling dogmas, rooted in unvetted spiritual impressions that resist scrutiny. Next, we examine the groupthink found in religious echo chambers and their belief-preserving mechanisms, along with their feelings-based spiritual feedback loops, which led to what we called the interfaith spiritual witness paradox, the unsettling reality that thousands of religions and tens of thousands of denominations all claim divine confirmation for contradictory beliefs, each proclaiming, "Mine, not yours, is true." Then we looked inward at Nephi's latter-day, all is well in Zion, echo chamber, where we also operate within belief-preserving mechanisms and feelings-based spiritual feedback loops. This led to the intrafaith LDS proposal paradox, in which college-age LDS students who pray fast and attend the temple for spiritual confirmation about marrying each other often receive conflicting spiritual answers, leaving only the apologetic fallback. "I'm sorry you got a different answer, but the Spirit just as clearly said no to me." Instead of brushing these contradictions aside, we suggested they should serve as a serious warning, our LDS canary in the coal mine, about the way we understand spiritual impressions and process divine guidance. Finally, we ended our last podcast by introducing the paradox of discerning discernment, the circular problem of needing the Spirit to discern the Spirit. And that's exactly where we pick up in this episode. As noted in the previous podcast, the first test of discernment is discerning whether you have it. This isn't just a clever observation, it highlights a real problem. If the gift of discernment is required to verify itself, we end up in a circular loop, trying to confirm the Spirit by using the very Spirit we're trying to confirm. Church manuals and general authorities have consistently taught that bishops and others are entitled to the gift of discernment as part of their callings. For example, Elder David A. Bednar taught in General Conference, "The gift of discernment enables a bishop to see beyond outward appearances." But what happens when two church leaders, both exercising the gift of discernment, arrive at conflicting answers? Which gift of discernment, if any, is the true one? This isn't a new dilemma. Even in Scripture, we see the scandal of a spiritual standoff between two apostles, Paul publicly confronting Peter over actions he believed compromised the gospel. Both held divine authority and were entitled to the gift of discernment, yet stood in direct conflict. Similarly, today, when faithful Latter-day Saints or church leaders each claim that same gift, yet arrive at contradictory spiritual conclusions, we face an intrafaith paradox. Conflicting spiritual witnesses, or acts of discernment, both presumed to come from the same divine source, ending in the same unresolved and scandalous claim, "Mine, not yours, is true." Today, such a spiritual standoff would likely be settled by appealing to authority, giving deference to the head of the church, in this case, Peter. Yet according to Paul, it was Peter who was in the wrong. The scandal remains. Conflicting spiritual witnesses or acts of discernment, both claimed or assumed to be divinely guided, can still directly oppose one another. But there's another way to resolve spiritual standoffs, beyond just appealing to authority. Let's turn to that now. On Mount Carmel, a spiritual standoff over which deity was the true God, the Canaanite god Baal, or the God of Israel, Jehovah, escalated into a dramatic spiritual showdown. Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to call down fire from heaven to prove their God's power. Despite crying out all day, Baal's prophets were met with silence. Elijah then prayed once, and God sent fire that consumed not only the sacrifice, but the altar, the stones, dust, and even the water surrounding it. The people fall on their faces, declaring, "The Lord, He is God." The 450 prophets of Baal were then put to death for misleading and corrupting the people with idolatry, decisively ending the contest and confirming the true God. This, then, is one way to settle religious disputes, over which God is the one true God, by turning spiritual standoffs into spiritual showdowns, as seen with Elijah on Mount Carmel, or when Moses confronted Pharaoh's magicians and sorcerers. But are such showdowns the best solution? Hardly, as we shall soon discover. Having explored spiritual standoffs and showdowns, we now turn inward. Navigating the spiritual realm requires a paradigm shift from expecting divine guidance to embracing divine becoming as an inner transformation. As Doctrine and Covenants, section 50, verse 24 teaches, "That which is of God is light, and he that receiveth light, and continueth in God, receiveth more light, and that light groweth brighter and brighter until the perfect day." This divine becoming, or spiritual transformation, invites us to recognize the light within us. Light that, if received and nurtured through continuing in God, grows ever brighter. No longer merely seen as an external source of divine guidance, but increasingly recognized as the very internal source of divine becoming. In navigating the spiritual realm, in this process of divine becoming, one of the first things we need to be aware of are three distinct models of spiritual discernment. Each shapes how people process spiritual truth claims, and each comes with its own risks and assumptions, but only one rescues us from the errors of the others. In Model 1, we face the familiar spiritual standoff, where conflicting spiritual claims go untested, leaving each person firmly convinced of their own truth. "Mine, not yours, is true." This happens across and within all religions, both interfaith and intrafaith, when two religious people of different faiths, or within one faith, both claim to be guided by a divine witness, or power, but receive opposing answers, with no way to resolve the contradiction. In the end, it's all internal witness, no external vetting. In Model 2, we turn from a spiritual standoff to a spiritual showdown, and what amounts to a rare, dramatic, and miraculous divine intervention that unmistakably settles the matter, leaving no room for faith, doubt, or debate, such as the spiritual showdown between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. This model fails in two ways. In the first place, for this model to work for you, you need the faith and power of Elijah to call down fire from heaven. And in the second place, even though it leaves no room for doubt or debate, it also leaves no room for faith, and as such, is a model that is dependent on signs and wonders, rather than faith and conviction. In the end, it's all external vetting, no internal witness. Lastly, we come to Model 3, spiritual scrutiny, the critical objective testing of spiritual impressions and truth claims from outside the spiritual feedback loop. This model protects us from the feelings-based errors of Model 1's spiritual standoff and the signs and wonders-based errors of Model 2's spiritual showdown. In the end, it offers both an internal witness and external vetting of that witness. Of the three, this is the model I'm advocating for in these podcasts, as it best captures the importance of testing spiritual impressions when navigating the spiritual realm. This spiritual scrutiny invites a new paradigm, one that rethinks how we Latter-day Saints navigate the spiritual realm and understand humanity as rational, volitional, and fallible moral agents. Rather than merely passive recipients of divine guidance, we are moral and divine agents, actively engaged in the process of divine becoming. This becoming unfolds within the vast inner landscape and depths of the mind or soul, a mental ocean where thoughts, feelings, and spiritual insights ebb and flow, revealing the dynamic nature of our spiritual potential and transformation. This new paradigm invites us to think of the inner depths of one's soul as a mental ocean, with surface opinions tossed to and fro by every turbulent wind, and lie above seemingly deep, but often shallow attitudinal undercurrents directly below them. Beneath those layers are the deepest undercurrents, those beliefs, desires, needs, hopes, and fears that shape our values and direct our destiny. And at the very foundation are the bedrock principles which shape our moral compass as rational, volitional, and fallible moral agents. These bedrock principles, illuminated by the light of Christ and shining as the light of reason within, offer the promise that he that receiveth light and continueth in God receiveth more light, and that light groweth brighter and brighter until the perfect day, as illustrated here. This new paradigm, shifting from divine guidance to divine becoming, has big implications for how we understand our divine identity, the light of Christ, our conscience, and our moral compass. Rather than seeing ourselves as passive recipients of God's direction, we begin to see ourselves as active participants in becoming like Him. This shift reframes divine identity not merely as those seeking guidance, but as children of God actively becoming rational, volitional, and fallible moral agents, beings of light and truth engaged in the divine process of becoming. It also changes how we understand the light of Christ, not just as external guidance, but as the divinity within us all, the ultimate source of light, life, truth, reason, and morality, and the very means by which we grow into divine likeness. In the same way, our conscience is no longer just a static sense of right and wrong. It is a fallible, evolving inner gauge of our growing sensitivity to what we perceive as right and wrong, a vital part of our ongoing journey in divine becoming. Likewise, our moral compass is a fallible, developing sense of moral direction shaped by who we are becoming as active moral agents on the path to divine likeness. Our moral growth, expressed through our individualized conscience and moral compass, is a constant, ongoing process shaped by our choices. As we turn away from light through sin, habit, or neglect, the light of Christ within us can dim, as illustrated here. Yet this divine becoming is real, a transformative process that touches both mind and soul. The promise that our inner light can grow brighter and brighter is not merely metaphorical, but a genuine, progressive state of being, a literal reflection of who and what we are at any given moment. With this mental ocean model in mind, let's ask a crucial question. Is our conscience and moral compass obsolete, infallible, or fallible? Postmodernists, who embrace the relativism of man is the measure of all things, often regard the conscience and moral compass as obsolete, mere byproducts of personal preference or cultural conditioning. This perspective contributes to the moral confusion and cultural fragmentation we see today. Pre-modernists, by contrast, uphold the absolutism of God, wherein God is the measure of all things, and often treat the conscience as infallible, essentially equating it with the voice and guidance of God Himself, always pointing to true north. This can foster a kind of reckless confidence, where moral intuition is mistaken for divine certainty. As Latter-day Saints, we reject both extremes. We do not ground moral truth in the shifting sands of human opinion, nor do we presume our moral perceptions are infallible, simply because they feel inspired. Instead, we root morality in reality, with life as the standard. We believe moral truth exists in what is required for human flourishing, and that we are called to discover and align with that truth. As rational, volitional, and fallible moral agents, our conscience and moral compass are neither obsolete nor infallible. They are fallible, evolving capacities, reflections of our current moral condition, and yet they remain essential tools in the ongoing process of divine becoming. Postmodernism, with its relativism of man, renders the conscience and moral compass obsolete, along with all opinions, attitudes, values, and even bedrock principles. If all is subjective, then nothing carries enduring moral weight, not even the guidance of parents, teachers, mentors, church leaders, or apostles and prophets. Pre-modernism, with its absolutism of God, treats the conscience and moral compass as infallible, indirectly elevating personal opinions, attitudes, values, and bedrock principles to the level of divine certainty. If one's inner moral sense is assumed to be infallible, then external guidance becomes unnecessary, even that of parents, teachers, mentors, church leaders, or prophets. In contrast, the Latter-day Saint view holds that conscience and moral compass are fallible yet real, vital evolving tools in our divine becoming. Grounded in eternal reality, with life as the standard of morality, we are rational, volitional, and fallible moral agents, learning to grow in light and truth. Because our moral capacities are real but incomplete, we need the guidance of others, including parents, mentors, teachers, church leaders, and prophets, to help refine our understanding and align more fully with divine truth and the light of Christ within. In short, if we view our conscience and moral compass as either obsolete or as divine infallible faculties, then what use or need is there for anything outside them, such as parents, church leaders, or prophets? For either their advice is just as relative and weightless as our own, in the postmodern view, or unnecessary and redundant, in the pre-modern view, since our own inner sense is presumed to be flawless. This leaves only one view, both sound, pragmatic, and undogmatic, that our inner conscience and moral compass are not obsolete nor infallible, but the developing and evolving moral intuitions, deliberations, and directions of a rational, volitional, and fallible moral agent, one engaged in the lifelong divine process of becoming. We've introduced a lot in this episode, so let's wrap up and prepare the ground for what's coming next. In navigating the spiritual realm, I outlined 3 models of spiritual discernment: the spiritual standoff model, the spiritual showdown model, the spiritual scrutiny model. To explain the third model, we introduced the metaphor of the mind as a mental ocean, ranging from surface-level opinions to bedrock principles. This mental depth provides the foundation from which we grow in truth and light under God's guidance. This led to our central insight. We are all rational, volitional, and fallible moral agents endowed with the light of Christ. So, here's the key question we'll end with. Which spiritual discernment model takes seriously the true nature of man? The spiritual standoff model relies entirely on internal witness, assumed to be infallible, with no external vetting. It bypasses the fallible nature of man and depends instead, for most Christians, on the internal witness of a supernatural God with no objective way of settling disagreements or disputes. The spiritual showdown model relies entirely on external vetting, miracles, power, outcomes, also assumed to be infallible, with no internal witness. It too bypasses the fallible nature of man and depends instead, for most Christians, on the all-powerful nature of a supernatural God. The spiritual scrutiny model integrates both internal witness and external vetting, both understood as fallible and imperfect. This is the only model that takes seriously the true nature of man as a rational, volitional, and fallible moral agent endowed with the light of Christ, but not endowed with an infallible way of understanding that divine illumination. Here is the key takeaway. Only the spiritual scrutiny model takes seriously the true nature of man. And because it does, it calls for a paradigm shift, away from simply seeking divine guidance, toward the deeper pursuit of divine becoming. That theological pivot from divine guidance to divine becoming is where we'll begin in the next emergency podcast, Because without it, meaningful spiritual discernment isn't just difficult, it's impossible. This ends this Unit 31 presentation. Thank you for watching. Join us in Unit 32 as we continue this emergency podcast series for parents of Latter-day Saint youth. We'll dive deeper into the rising storm, driven by artificial superintelligence, social media influencers, and unvetted spiritual impressions, forces powerful enough to overwhelm today's youth beyond their ability to cope.